Hello, guys. How are you? We are back with the next chapter as the constitution of a man as a political entity, right? Now, when we go into this, we'll have a plethora of symbolic ways of putting the things together, such as I will show you guys, but there will be a plethora of things that will show you the example of separation between body and state and entities of that nature. So let's just dive right in, guys. Man is already a colonial aggregation of cells, and to consider him an individual would be an error, right? Because we are an amalgamation of multiple cells, amalgamation of many T cells, amalgamation of gonads, amalgamation of many things in duality, right? Thus, we see that man himself is already a political organism. Even if we do not consider a mass of men, sickness could be considered to be a disloyalty to the remaining organisms on the part of one organism. The heart is in revolt because it cannot or will not cooperate with the remainder of the body. If we permit the heart thus to revolt, the kidneys, taking the example of the heart, may in their turn rebel and cease to work for the good of the organism. Right, so we see how they're using the terminology of the human anatomy to show us how governing bodies govern states and individuals and bureaus, right? This rebellion multiplying to other organs and the glandular system brings about the death of the individual. Thus, we see that there can be no compromise with rebellion. Like the individual man, the state is a collection of aggregations. So what it's trying to really demonstrate, right, within this, a man as a political entity, as an organism, right? It's trying to display that the state is a collection, right? It is all unified. The system is in place that everything can be unified together. That's intrinsically what it's set up for. The political entities within the state must all of them cooperate for the greater good of the state, lest the state itself fall asunder and die. For with the disaffection of any single distrust, we discover an example set for other districts, and we discover at length the entire state falling. So, like previously mentioned, if one organ is not working, this makes for all the other parts of the organs to not want to work and rebel, right? And this creates this drop off, and this creates this cancer-like thing where it's going to affect the entire host, right? So this is the danger of revolution. Look at the earth. The organism of earth is an individual organism. Earth has its organs, the various races and nations of men, where one of these is permitted to remain disaffected. Earth itself is threatened with death. Thus, the putrescent illness of capitalist states spreading its pus and bacteria into the healthy countries of the world would not do otherwise than bring about the death of Earth, unless these ill organisms are brought into loyalty and obedience and made to function for the greater good of the worldwide state, right? This is how they are trying to demonstrate how politics and man are deeply intertwined together. Now, the constitution of man is composed that the individual cannot function efficiently without the alignment of each and every part of the organ of his anatomy. As the average individual is incapable in an unformed and uncultured state, as witness the barbarians of the jungle, so must be trained into a coordination of his organic function by exercise, education, and work towards specific goals. The tenets of rugged individualism, personal determinism, self-will, imagination, and personal creativeness are alike in the masses, antipathetic to the good of the greater state. So these willful and unaligned forces are no more than illness, which will bring about disaffection, disunity, and at length the collapse of the group to which the individual is attached. The constitution of man lends itself easily, thoroughly to certain and positive regulation from without all of its functions, including those of thinking, obedience, and loyalty. And these things must be controlled if a greater state is to ensue. So, guys, we have to specifically look at this terminology, right? The functions of thinking, obedience, and loyalty have to be controlled in order for the greater state to ensue. As man is a political organism, to be controlled through psychopolitics, it is essential for the greater state to control these aspects, right? It is essential to control personal determinism, self-will, imagination, and personal creativeness. Because if these things are not controlled, then it will not be the greater good for the state, right? While it may seem desirable to the surgeon to amputate one or another limb or organ in order to save the remainder, it must be pointed out that this expediency is not entirely possible of accomplishment where one considers entire nations. A body deprived of organ can be observed to be lessened in its effectiveness. That is intrinsically what these two things are trying to correlate with each other, right? If they are not functioning together, there will be a mishap, there will be clashing, there will be things of that nature that's going to evolve because they aren't controlled. The world deprived of the workers, now enslaved by the insane and nonsensical idiocies of the capitalists and monarchs of earth, would, if removed, create a certain disability in the one world state. Just as we see the victor forced to rehabilitate the population of a conquered country at the end of a war, thus any effort to depopulate a disaffected portion of the world might have some consequence. However, let us consider the inroad of virus and bacteria, hostile to the organism, as we see that unless we conquer the germ, the organ or organism which is attacking will itself suffer. In any state, we have a certain individuals who operate in the role of the virus and germ, and these attacking the population or any group within the population produce by themselves self-willed greed, a sickness in the organ, which then generally spreads to the whole. The constitution of man as an individual body, or the constitution of a state or a portion of the state as a political organism, are analogous. It is the mission of the psychopolitics first to align the obedience and the goals of the group, and then maintain their alignment by their eradication of the effectiveness of the persons and personalities which might swerve the group towards disaffection. But in the field of conquest, the nations less enlightened, where the Russian state does not have power, it is not as feasible to remove the entire self-willed individual. So guys, a lot of stuff was said. Let's just go through what that means. So, the world deprived of workers, now enslaved, right? Just as we see the population and how germs and viruses are attacking the entire whole, right? So we see little microcosms within the cosmos, little microcosms within society that are, we may say it as propaganda, we may see it as like slight things that are just occurring in day-to-day life. But to be completely honest, these little microcosms are self-greed for the state, because the state wants to maintain its statehood, right? It is not for the individual, it is for the greater good of the state, for the entirety of the state. Psychopolitics makes it possible to remove that part of his personality which in itself is making havoc with the person's own constitution, as well as with the group with which the person is connected. If the animal man were permitted to continue undisturbed by counter-revolutionary propaganda, if we were left to work under the well-planned management of the state, we would discover little sickness amongst men, and we would discover no sickness in the state. But where the individual is troubled by conflicting propaganda, whereas he made the effect of revolutionary activities, where he is permitted to think thoughts critical to the state itself, where he is permitted to question those in whose natural charge he falls, he would discover his constitution to suffer. We would discover from this disaffection the additional disaffection of his heart and other portions of his anatomy. So certain in this principle that when one finds a sick individual, could one search deeply enough, he would discover a misaligned loyalty and an interrupted obedience to the group's unit. So it's important to, when we transcribe or like try to refer to this, it's important to understand that a lot of the propaganda used even within nations, whatever country you're from, it's to create a patriarchal view. It's to create a state-abiding view, right? There are those who foolishly have embarked upon some spiritual Alice in Wonderland voyage into what they call the subconscious or the unconscious mind, and who, under the guise of psychotherapy, would seek to make well the disaffection of body organs, but it is to be noted that their results were singularly lacking in success. When hypnotism was first invented in Russia, it was observed that all that was necessary was to command the unresisting individual to be well in order many times to accomplish that fact. The limitation of hypnoticism was that many subjects were not susceptible to its uses, and thus hypnotism has had to be improved upon in order to increase the suggestibility of individuals who would not otherwise be reached. Thus, any nation has had the experience of growing well again, as well as a whole organism, when placing sufficient force in play against a disaffected group. Just as hypnosis, many organ can be commanded into greater loyalty and obedience, so can any political group be commanded into greater loyalty and obedience should sufficient force be employed. However, force often brings about destruction, and it is occasionally not feasible to use broad mass force to accomplish this end's view. Thus, it is necessary to align the individual against his desire not to conform. Just as recognized truth that man must conform to his environment, so it is recognized truth, and will become more so as years proceed, that even the body of man could be commanded into health. So, as we've read here, a lot of the psychopolitics has to do with using hypnosis, which is psychopolitics, and using hypnosis to make you follow, right? Not just follow, but really submit to the system that's in place and really conform to your environment, conforming to the external stimuli at which you're experiencing, right? Whatever is around you is the external stimuli. So if they control the external stimuli, it is your duty to survive, and to not only survive, but to survive during these external stimuli, whatever the external stimuli may be, right? The constitution of man renders itself peculiarly adapted to realignment of loyalties, where these loyalties are indigestible to the constitution of the individual itself. Such loyalties to the petite bourgeoisie, to the capitalists, to the anti-Russian ideas, we find the individual body peculiarly susceptible to sickness, and thus we can clearly understand epidemics, illnesses, mass neuroses, tumults, and confusions of the United States and other capitalist countries. Here we find the worker improperly and incorrectly loyal, and thus we find the worker ill. To save him and establish him correctly and upon his goal toward a greater state, it is an overpowering necessity to make it possible for him to grant his loyalties in a correct direction, in that his loyalties are swerved and his abundance cravenly demanded by persons antipathetic to his general good. And in that, these persons are few. Even in a capitalist nation, the goal and direction of psychopolitics is clearly understood. To benefit the worker in such a plight, it is necessary to eradicate by general propaganda, by other means, and by his own cooperation and self-willedness, the perverted leaders. It is necessary as well to indoctrinate the educated strata into the tenets of the principles of cooperation with the environment, and thus to ensure the worker less warped leadership, less craven doctrine, and more cooperation with the ideas of the communist state. The technologies of the psychopolitics are directed to this end. So what we have to really understand from these takeaways is that it is the ideology of hypnosis usually requires force. But like I said previously, force will bring destruction. Rather than using force within society, what is being used is a operation of where you have to cooperate within this environment, and this is how you will have to assimilate into this society, right? This is not a pluralistic society. You would have to assimilate to whatever your external stimuli is, right? So therefore, these technologies that are in place are really in place to make sure that within these capitalist regions that the worker is going to self-willingly submit. Because if they were forced, and if they found out what was really going on and how evil most of this stuff was going on behind the scenes, it wouldn't be something they would want to abide by. It wouldn't be something that would make the entire ecosystem run, right? This would not be an entire aggregation of cells. It would just be, it would not be an aggregation. It would rather fall off. That's why the man as a political organism is so deeply intertwined to how the state uses the technologies, propaganda, and other mainstream media devices to control the narrative and to control how society shapes, feels, and perceives life, right? Next episode, we will keep going on this. We will finish the entire book, but this was chapter 2, and thank you guys for watching.